Well, I'm Jay Forrester. Originally, I grew up on a cattle ranch in Nebraska, so I came to MIT to escape the taking care of cattle in MIT winters. I graduated from the University of Nebraska in electrical engineering. Came to MIT in 1939 for 1 year of electrical engineering graduate study, and so far I have not gotten away. I was involved in feedback control systems for physical equipment, working under Professor Gordon Brown in the servomechanisms laboratory throughout World War II, and developing equipment that went into the military field, both for the Army and the Navy. One of the radar sets for which we made the controls and the gyro vertical that controlled them went on the carrier Lexington. That's actually the second Lexington. First one had been sunk. And there were some electronic difficulties in it, so I went to Pearl Harbor to see what the problem was and to do the repair. That took a week or two, and I wasn't finished when the executive officer asked if I would like to go with them on their next tour while I finished my work. So I said yes, and that brought me into the battle off the shore of Tarawa, and later a task force down through the Marshall Islands, I guess it is. I always mix up the Marshalls and the Marianas. Between the sunrise and sunset chain, bombing airports, which the Japanese didn't like, and by 11 o'clock that night they managed to torpedo the carrier I was on, which took one of the 4 propellers out of operation. And then it went back to, on its 3 propellers, to Pearl Harbor. And that is, in some ways, is relevant because it was this whole area of feedback control systems that led into encounter with Admiral Louis de Flores, a very flamboyant Spanish type admiral with pointed waxed mustaches. As a sidelight, he's the only person I've ever known of who apparently could get authority to land his seaplane on the sailing basin in front of MIT, which he would do on Alumni Day, come to the alumni dinner, lunch, and when the talks began to get boring, he would rev up his seaplane, drown everybody out, and take off. Anyway, he had the vision of an extension of the pilot training things like the link trainers that had been used to train pilots. He had the idea that he would like one that was sufficiently sophisticated that you could go from wind tunnel data of a proposed model of an airplane to let the pilots get a sense of the feel of that airplane by a cockpit that was driven by solutions to the aerodynamic equations based on data from a wind tunnel. At that time, computers were entirely analog, and the assumption was that it would be an analog computer, and we started down that road. And soon came to the conclusion that the problem was so complex that an attempt in an analog computer would give us nothing more than the solution to the faults and deficiencies of the computer itself, rather than telling us enough about the airplane. And at that time, then, an MIT graduate named Perry Crawford was working for de Flores' activity in the Special Devices Center of the Navy in, I think it was Port Washington, Long Island. So he was sort of the technical officer having to do with what we were doing, and he is the first person to have called my attention to digital computers and the possibility that they would be an improvement over the analog computers that we were contemplating. And Perry Crawford was a very interesting person. He was a visionary. He was absolutely uninhibited. He would go see the head of naval operations. He would go and see the Secretary of the Navy. He would go anywhere, any place to sort of promote what he wanted to what he thought was coming next. So he became a very active promoter for computers, initially simply to work in the aircraft analyzer. Then it was Crawford who began to see the possibility of computers as combat information centers. And so working with him, we began to think along the same lines. And in about 1948, wrote a couple of papers on how a digital computer might be used to consolidate the information in a Navy task force. Information from the air, from the surface, and any information you might have from submarines into a single combat picture. Then by 1948, I think, there were getting to be enough echoes in the military about digital computers, I think in a substantial extent from Perry Crawford and from the work we were doing, that it became a subject to being talked about. And Carl Compton, who was president of MIT, was also head of the Military Research and Development Board, and he was beginning to get these comments, rumors, assertions, and questions. So he asked us to give him a report on, or a paper on what we thought the future of computers in the military might be. I think the date of that was 1948. And so we set out to answer that, and we planned the scope of it against the background of knowing what had been done and spent, and a number of people who had been involved in the development of radar for the military. And we knew that this was a much bigger operation, but the scope of the radar work was vastly greater than anything that people were talking about then about computers, and we began to talk about something much greater even than the radar work. And so we used the radar history as a jumping off place for this report. And the report culminated at the end with a large chart having 15 years across the top and about 12 areas of military application of computers down the side, and every square filled in with what we thought the state of affairs would be and how much would be spent in each money in each square over 15 years. There are not very many people that make 15-year plans even today, and I don't know that there'd ever been a 15-year plan in military equipment before. But this came down, summing it all down in the right-hand corner, to about $2 billion of expenditure over the 15 years. We went into a meeting with the Navy where they thought the agenda was whether or not we could have another $100,000, and we told them they would be spending $2 billion. And there was a very substantial communication gap in that meeting. But I think this is part of the background then that led up to the moment when the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb, and the military and the Air Force realized they did not have an air defense system that had any chance of coping with incoming bombers carrying atomic bombs. This became a crisis within the military. And at that point, our path began to merge with the interests of George Valley, an associate professor of physics, who had also been head of a research group looking into the future of air defense for the military. And they had gotten as far as realizing that they were going to have needed something in the way of computers to handle and consolidate radar data, but they had no idea of what this might be. I think that led then to a discussion between Valley and Jerry Wiesner, who later became president of MIT, but I think at that time was head of the Research Lab of Electronics, who suggested to Valley that he ought to come up and see us because we had a computer that might be the road to getting what he wanted. So Valley and I had various meetings, and we gave him these reports, the two earlier ones about how to use a computer in combat information systems, and this one about the future of computers in the military. And that, I think, clicked very strongly with him. At that time, we were running out of patience with the Navy. They were in the process of probably cutting off the funds that we were using for the Whirlwind computer, but then Valley and the Air Force picked up the ball and continued the funding and began to promote the idea of computers in air defense, which of course would be looked upon as a completely harebrained, radical, impractical idea by people who scarcely knew what a digital computer might be. The next step was one that was fairly customary at that time, and that was to appoint a committee to look into the whole matter. And this was a committee that included head of the Air Force from Great Britain, head of the Air Force from Canada, likewise people from the US, Nyquist of Feedback Control Systems in Bell Labs was a member. Leslie Groves, who had been the executive of the Manhattan District, was a member. George Valley and I were, and I think Bob Everett, my associate, was also a member. Study groups of that kind, I feel, seldom do very much unless somebody comes into them with a proposal that is viable and acceptable. In other words, such a group doesn't generate the daring idea, but if there is someone that comes in with a proposition, it may carry. And that's what happened, because Valley, Bob Everett and I had the proposal that a computer could handle military data. And coincidentally, we had by that time arrived at the point where a radar set out here at the Bedford Air Base was wired over telephone lines, data lines, to the Whirlwind computer. We had written the programs for running the radar data and turning it into control instructions for a fighter plane. And so some demonstrations were run for Project Charles. The Air Defense Command loaned a bomber to fly out offshore over eastern Massachusetts, and the Whirlwind computer would direct the fighter from Hanscom for an interception. And in spite of the noisy data and the amount of ground clutter and the radar signals and so forth, the computer would throw away those and extrapolate the tracks of the two airplanes and run an interception with such precision that we had to fly them at different altitudes, or we would run the risk of crashing the planes. This was fairly impressive because it really showed in real life, in real time, a computer doing what we were suggesting was possible. The upshot of that was to basically approve the idea of a computer in air defense to coordinate the data. And that then led to setting up the Lincoln Laboratory with a division for radar, and initially did not have the computer division because we were still in the Barta building on Mass Avenue in Cambridge, and were sort of negotiating our role and insisting on our status if we were to join them. And that took a while, but we eventually then came in as Division 6 with me as head of that division and Bob Everett as associate head. And basically we were then in command of doing the computers for what became the SAGE system.